I believe that the problems facing Russia were very deep in the early 1990s. It was very complex. An empire had collapsed, the Soviet system had collapsed, the state planning mechanism had collapsed. I worked on a project in 1990, which we called the Grand Bargain, which was to help Gorbachev with financial assistance so that Gorbachev's reforms could go forward. And the White House rejected it completely.
喺睇片之前，大家記得分享、讚好同訂閱灼見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁你就唔會錯過我哋嘅最新影片。
一齊睇下 Jeffrey Sachs 教授嘅訪談。
You try to ensure that the less developed parts of the world have a level playing field by helping them carry out economic reforms. So, what drives your aspiration to help these less fortunate countries like the Latin Americas, the Eastern Europe? Yes.
To me, the issue is very much common sense. The main driver of economic improvement in history has been technology. So over the course of many millennia and in an accelerating basis in recent decades, we have improved the capacity to do most things in economic life, whether it is farming, industrial production, computation, and virtually every other area of the economy. And for me, it's very basic that given this capacity, there should be no economic suffering in the world of basic conditions, basic deprivation, extreme poverty, because while that was inevitable 200 years ago, it should be out of the question today. So since I'm an economist and I see the power of our tools, it's rather frustrating to me to know that there are still 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, many hundreds of millions of children who don't have enough to eat or a place in a schoolroom or other basic amenities for a healthy and productive life. And I think we should absolutely end that suffering through common sense understanding of economic strategy and economic development, and by global cooperation to make the steps needed for change. Of course, the world has not been used to this kind of cooperation in the past, and confrontation is more normal. Countries do not play well together. Often too much tension, too many wars, too many conflicts for our own good. And so the call for this kind of betterment faces several obstacles in practice. First, some people say there's nothing that can be done to improve the situation. The poor countries have only themselves to blame. Maybe they're too corrupt or too unstable or bad at policy, but we can't help from the outside. So that's one argument that's made. I think that argument is wrong. Another argument is we can't afford to help, we have our own problems. And therefore, we should only look internally. I think that this is also a mistake, because if we solve the problems of extreme poverty, we also solve many other problems as well: violence, conflict, instability, environmental degradation. The benefits are global of having a more fair and prosperous world. So that's a second kind of argument. The third reality is that there's so much conflict among the major powers, for instance, the US and China, that they don't take the time to even ask the question, what could we do together to address the situation in Africa or the situation in Central Asia? And so they compete, but not in a very healthy way, in a very dangerous way. So I've been making these arguments about ending poverty or achieving global sustainable development for much of my career. And occasionally my recommendations are heeded, and I think the results are pretty good when they are. But much of the time, my recommendations are viewed as too idealistic or unaffordable or other reasons for rejection that I believe are absolutely a misunderstanding, because a lot of the opposition comes from people who do not have the experience or the knowledge or the on-the-ground work to understand what is feasible and what we should be doing. So this has been the role that I've tried to play throughout my career, and I didn't expect that I would do this exactly when I started, but soon after I became a professor at Harvard University, I began working with particular governments on particular challenges, and came to understand both that the problems were solvable, but that the difficulties in solving them involved global misunderstandings or misinterpretations. And so there's a lot that needs to be done of explaining, advocating, writing, arguing, debating, pleading, and so forth.
In addition to your advocacy for poverty alleviation and sustainable development, you are renowned for your shock therapy recommendations to Asian European countries like Russia, Estonia, and Poland. These nations faced various challenges in the decades that followed. How did you contribute to the success of their economic reforms? And looking back, would you still offer the same advice to them?
You have to make a very big distinction between the countries that were admitted to the European Union and those that were kept out. So the countries that were admitted to the European Union, like Poland or Estonia or Slovenia, all of which I advised, have had a very successful period during the past 30 years. Their economy expanded, and I can give you an example in Poland. In 1989, Poland's economy was 1/3 the per capita income of Germany. Today, it is 2/3 the per capita income of Germany. So it's made huge progress relative to its next door neighbor. And the whole advice that I gave, which was unify with Europe, establish open trade, establish a convertible currency, become part of the European Union, succeeded. And similarly, in Estonia and in Slovenia, I helped them to introduce a new currency to replace the currency that had collapsed. The ruble in the case of Estonia and the Yugoslav currency in the case of Slovenia, they introduced a new currency that became a very strong, stable currency. So I'm very proud of that. I advised the Soviet Union in the last year of President Gorbachev's presidency, and then advised President Yeltsin in the first 2 years of Yeltsin's presidency. And I recommended for Russia the same that I recommended for Poland, the same set of policies. But in the case of Russia, the United States did not accept that philosophy, because my philosophy is there are not enemies, there are partners and counterparts, and Russia was not an enemy. Russia was trying to become a normal, society and economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we should have accepted Russia as a counterpart and not viewed Russia as a continuing enemy. But in the United States, the philosophy of the security apparatus was that Russia continued to be a threat. We should not support Russia's economy. They are an enemy, more or less. And if Russia weakens, that's to the advantage of the United States, they believed. This is the opposite of my philosophy. So when I made the recommendations to help Russia, all of those recommendations were rejected by the United States. And interestingly, I spent one very frustrating year as President Yeltsin's advisor because I was trying to get the U.S. on side to help. That was 1992. And at the end of 1992, I explained that there's nothing more I can do. I resigned. And at that point, a new finance minister was appointed, and he asked me come visit him in Washington because he was at the World Bank. And one morning, I visited him in Washington, and he begged me to stay one more year as advisor. And I told him, I don't think I can help you because everything I'm saying is not being accepted. He said, please help for one more year. And so I did. And that year was the same. No benefit, no effect. So I believe that the problems facing Russia were very deep in the early 1990s. It was very complex. An empire had collapsed, the Soviet system had collapsed, the state planning mechanism had collapsed, the country was stuck in a very significant financial crisis. So it would not have been easy in general to make some kind of miraculous help, but I think much could have been done to help stabilize the situation and diminish the crisis. But the United States would have had to help, and Europe would have had to help, but they didn't want to help. This is the biggest problem. Now, that attitude continued because the United States continued to view Russia as on the other side against us. And the idea of the United States was expand the U.S. military alliance to the east, first to Central Europe, then to Eastern Europe, then to Ukraine. And this idea of the military alliance pushing towards Russia is the reason that the Ukraine war broke out. And so I think that the U.S. policy has been wrong-headed since 1990, and we're suffering consequences of that today.
I still remember before the collapse of Soviet Union, the then Secretary for State, U.S. James Baker,
Yes.
insisted that U.S. government would only provide so-called technical assistance rather than anything concrete.
You know, Baker explained in February 1990 to Gorbachev that NATO would not move eastward by 1 inch. And this was made very clear to Gorbachev, also by the German foreign minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher. But when Baker returned to Washington, Bush said, no, we do what we want. We won. And that is the big mistake of the U.S., to think that they won. Instead of cooperating, they wanted to win the Cold War. And it would have been much better to cooperate and to create a partner and a peaceful counterpart instead of one deeply distrustful of the United States. And the idea of Baker that we will not give technical help is also very ironic because I worked on a project in 1990, which we called the Grand Bargain, which was to help Gorbachev with financial assistance so that Gorbachev's reforms could go forward. And the White House rejected it completely. Then supposedly Baker changed his mind later on, but it was too late. And so that kind of support never materialized.
Professor, you just mentioned that the United States wants to slow down China's economic development.
Yes.
Do you think the United States will succeed? And it seems like the United States and some of the countries are promoting anti-globalization. And do you think that anti-globalization is an inevitable trend in the future?
The United States will not succeed in slowing China's economy. And I think Huawei's recent success with the Mate Pro 60 is an example because Huawei was a target of the United States. The U.S. has tried to kill Huawei's business. It's tried to tell all other countries don't do business with Huawei, and it tried to restrict advanced chips so that Huawei would be permanently thrown out of the smartphone market. Just recently, of course, Huawei launched its new smartphone, which is selling like crazy. And while there still is some technical discussion of exactly what's in there, the early indications are that it is a very high performance phone with a very advanced chip that in some ways at least mimics the NVIDIA GPU chip. So something has been achieved, certainly, showing that the U.S. idea that it can create a chokehold on China's technology is very much exaggerated. That's my opinion. Most of the world does not want to side with the United States in this. Even Europe, which is the closest geopolitically to the United States, is quite uneasy with the U.S. approach to China. We've seen in the EU-China bilateral promises of continued open trade. In the German-China dialogue in the last few days, commitments to expanded trade, because Europe really would suffer enormously if it broke trade with China the way the United States wants. And so Europe is not very happy with the U.S. approach. It's usually a loyal subsidiary ally to the U.S. But in this case, I think the cost would be too high. So I don't think that the U.S. will succeed in this. I think it is a misguided idea. I'm against it in principle, but I also believe that it is impractical, that it can't succeed.
中意名家分析，記得俾 like 同埋分享，支持同訂閱卓見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁就唔會錯過我哋嘅新片。